Hello there, sports fans. Happy first day of spring. You can see outside here in Minnesota, it's not terribly spring-like. We're supposed to have snow tonight. Still kind of gray and rainy. But I figured it's a good day to pick back up again with Romeo and Juliet. Missed a day yesterday. Busy doing other things. I was thinking today about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, about the Lord of the Rings, and how remarkably prescient that man was. Especially about the 20th and 21st centuries' sense of despair, and how do we overcome it. We don't know yet the end of the story. And we won't know unless we read on. So, we read on. We're still in Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet. This is Scene 3. I've been talking up to this point about the idea of the scholastic debate. The debate between the academics in the College of Paris and Oxford and elsewhere. Between the nominalists and the realists. And I think that's a theme that runs throughout the play. We have to acknowledge, of course, that there's a lot of other water under the bridge that occurs between the height of that debate, which you can pretty much put at 1277, and the time that the Bard was writing in 1590s, almost the 1600s. There's a lot that happens that also affects him and affects his culture. But no work is ever written in a vacuum. All the artistic works that we have reflect the surrounding culture that has been developing for hundreds of years. Our own culture right now reflects what's gone on for the past 100 years. We're still thinking about what it means to be part of this experiment of the Enlightenment, and what it means to be here in this hostile world. We're still dealing with the fallout from the wars of the 20th century, or the Spanish flu of the 1918s, or the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. We're still dealing with the chaos that occurred on the campuses of the 1960s and the 1970s. Still dealing with the effects of contraception and abortion on the nuclear family and the destruction of the nuclear family. We're dealing with all those things. So our current artwork reflects that. And that's 100, maybe 200 years. Shakespeare's literature is dealing with a similar thing. Events and ideas and philosophies that have been around for hundreds of years, which were still very much prominent in the mind of the bard and of his audience. So there's a scholastic debate coming to a head right around the end of the 13th century, 1277. And there were literary works that also affected Shakespeare, and there were historical events that affected Shakespeare. So before I launch into this next scene, just to bring up one or two of the historical events that had an impact on Shakespeare's world. 1277 was that great shutting down of the debate of the scholastics there by Archbishop Tempier there in Paris, and Oxford followed suit because Oxford did what Paris did, sort of keeping lockstep with the other colleges. And I think that eventually led or furthered the split between the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, what would later be Germany, and Rome itself. And thus the Reformation that occurred too, because the Reformation, which sparks the early part of the 1500s, is between those princes of Germany and the princes of Rome, so to speak. But if you look at the era right after that shutting down of the scholastic debate, the 1300s, now there's an era of disaster for you. If you want to really put your own era in perspective, study a little history. Look at what the hellish things that other people have gone through before you. And it gives you a real sense, not only that you're in a good company of suffering bastards who have dealt with this sort of thing for years, but also puts into perspective how bad things are in your generation. I just watched Ken Burns' Dust Bowl series. It's a very fine documentary series. Man, that was a rough time to be alive. But the 1300s go down as sort of one of the rougher times to be alive in Europe. Sometimes referred to as the disaster of the 1300s. Strange, because you could say that it began all peachy-like. There was a year of Jubilee in the 1300s. Rome, the Pope had called a year of Jubilee. And in the year of Jubilee, what happens is, Jubilee comes from the original Jewish practice of blowing the horn, the jubal. You know, toodaloo, you blow the ram's horn, the jubal, and it proclaims this festival wherein sins are forgiven and debts are remitted and people get special graces and dispensations, especially for making pilgrimages, for going to holy sites. And so in the Jubilee year, the 1300, there was a special dispensation given to the faithful for making the pilgrimage to Rome. Pilgrims all over Europe, traveled to various places, various holy sites. And so going to Rome gave you special dispensation from your sins and debts forgiven, things like that. Now you could look at it cynically and say it's also a way of the Pope making money, because Rome was kind of a hovel. The city had fallen into real decay, and having pilgrims come in brought in a lot of dough, because when you get pilgrims, they come in and they have to lodge somewhere and eat somewhere, and they buy trinkets and they put money into the coffers and things like that. So there was a lot of that going on. But 1300 was, some could say, was a year where things were great. Just come off of a 100, 200 year spell of warm weather, where you'd had an abundance of crops, you'd have warmer weather on a regular basis, and not a lot of inclement weather had occurred in Europe, and so you had this abundance of crops and a growth of the population, people moving to be more citified, so part of the city landscape rather than the country. You had, even in the country, you had farmers doing fairly well, the tenant farmers in the feudal system in Europe. So the 1300s seemed to have been a crashingly good year, good era, top of the world. Everything was fine. Sort of like 2000, year 2000 in America. Everybody's scared of the Y2K problem, as they were, by the way, scared of the end of the world in the 1300s. But nevertheless, it seemed like everything was going great. 2000, you had, after that Jubilee year, you had certain events that occurred, and I don't need to go into total detail with them, but the first big event was the moving of the papacy from Rome to Avignon in France. What came to be known as the Avignon papacy. The Pope had the Holy Father of the Roman Church had as his center Rome in Italy for many, many years, and it was sort of, he was the heir of the Roman thing, of the Roman Empire, there in the West anyway. The West and the East had severed from one another, and the Eastern Roman Empire was technically, it was the official inheritor of the Roman power. And Western Rome had sort of fallen into the power of the Pope. And so his seat of power, his whole thing was there in Rome, Italy. But the big cheese on the block, the big power, the political power at the time, was the French king, the Frankish king, who was the Carolingian dynasty in France. And they become very, very wealthy. So wealthy that they had great influence over the popes. And eventually, when the Pope moved to Avignon in France, he had almost direct control over the church, almost like he could dictate, the French king could dictate what happened in the church. It was a very close union between the popes and the French popes and the French king. So the move to Avignon was a big deal because people were, you can imagine what the psychological impact would be like on people. Here was this shakeup of a tradition of the Pope being in Rome, and a shakeup that occurred very soon after proclaiming how great Rome was in the 1300s, and then I think it was 1307 when he moved to Avignon, maybe 1309. I'll have to look up the date, or you could look it up for me. But one way or the other, he moved there to Rome, and then was there until almost the end of the 1300s. It was close to a 70 or 80 year exile, if you will, in Avignon before the Pope ever moved back to Rome. So there was that shake-up. That was kind of a psychological shake-up that occurred in the 1300s. Then in 1314, I think it was, or was it 1313? I think it was 1314. There was a strange thing that occurred on the planet. And this is only recently that people started studying this, which is the impact of climate on society. And this is the last 20 years or so that people have been studying this. So we've got to take into account that this was not really acknowledged very much. But in 1314, the planet cooled down very suddenly. Like there was a spring, much like ours now, where it was cooler than usual and wetter than usual. And that rain that began sometime in April didn't stop for 3 or 4 months. You'd have occasional days of sun, but mostly it was rain and cold. Some 2 or 3 degrees colder than usual, which doesn't seem like a big deal to us, but when you consider that, that means that the temperature overall doesn't rise above a certain level, and you have rain and you have gray month after month after month, that gets to be quite of a downer. And it was what was the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which lasted apparently until the 1970s, into our own era. And the Little Ice Age was a period where great famine occurred because crops failed. When you get that much rain and not enough sun, you have whole crops that fail, especially if you've got only one subsistence crop that you're dealing with, wheat, for instance. And that's exactly what happened in 1315, was that there was this massive crop failure and starvation across Europe. And that starvation continued for many, many years because the farmers couldn't get a leg up on how to deal with this new crisis. How do you deal with the fact that your crops fail every single year? So here they were dealing with that, and that depleted their immune systems because they weren't eating enough, and because it was so gray and it was so wet. Their whole culture, Europe, was suffering tremendously with depleted immune systems. And then all of a sudden something else happened in 1345. And for those students of history who follow this, 1345 was a very, very dark year because that was the beginning of the plague, the bubonic plague in Europe. And the bubonic plague, which occurred in one form or another for the next 200 or 300 years, was really a disaster for Europe. It was 1/3 of the population died during the course of the bubonic plague. And it occurred, apparently, from what modern research tells us, it occurred primarily because, not rats, but because of hamsters, which I find a little amusing. There's a large rodent, like a hamster, that lives apparently in the Caucasus Mountains and infests the mountains there, like a gopher town. And when the dramatic cooling occurred and the starvation of the failing of plant life occurred, those the populations of those large hamsters died off very suddenly. And the fleas that were feeding on them, which carried the plague, had nowhere else to go. They had to find a new host. And so what did they do? But they began to infect the travelers that traveled down the Silk Road through the Caucasus Mountains from China down into the Middle East. And that's where the plague then began to infect the Middle East and then began to infect Europe via trade. Well, one way or the other, 1345, bad year for Europe. And the Black Plague eventually was at least controlled sometime in the late 1700s, but that's a long time to have constant swaths of Black Plague coming back again and again and again. Now you add on to that the fact that in the 1300s you had massive warfare that occurred on the continent. You had what was called the 100 Years' War between France and England. Much of that was driven by the necessity of starvation and by the problems with the Black Death. But it sparked this warfare that continued for generations to come. And it also sparked, later on, a warfare in England called the War of the Roses, which was a warfare for the succession of the crown. That kind of awfulness in a whole society is, again, hard for us to fathom. But Shakespeare would have grown up at least with the memory of this, if nothing else, because in the 1400s, when the War of the Roses finally came to conclusion, it came to conclusion primarily because the two houses that were warring with one another were finally united, and they were united, if memory serves, under the father of Henry VIII. Henry VIII, whose own father was sort of the solution to this problem. Henry VIII took over a throne in the 1500s that had suffered great civil war and famine and plague and violence across the nation. So when Henry knew that he had to get an heir in order to solidify the throne, he was in a bad way. This is in the 1500s here we're talking. And Henry himself had to have a male heir so that he could pass the crown on to a secure king. And his first wife couldn't give him that heir because she had been infected with syphilis, which Henry had contracted himself when he was a roving young man, a randy young man. He had contracted syphilis. He passed it to his first wife. She could no longer grant him an heir, and so he was between a rock and a hard place, so to speak. He had to have an heir in order to secure the crown, and he couldn't have an heir with that wife, so he sued for divorce from Rome. 1500s now, okay, so this has gone on this is 200 years past the 1277s. He sued for divorce from Rome, but the problem was that his wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been married to Henry's brother before him. And when his brother died suddenly, the family knew that they had to continue this connection to the great power in Europe, which was the power of Spain. And so Henry had actually applied from Rome for dispensation to marry his brother's widow. You follow here? Okay? Catherine was his brother's wife, his brother's widow. If he were to marry her, that would be considered incest, unless the church proclaimed that it was okay for him to do so. And so he applied for dispensation to be able to do so from Rome, knowing that if he didn't secure this, he was looking at civil war again in his nation. Rome granted him this dispensation, but did so grudgingly, because Rome had a long-standing problem, not just with England, but with the Holy Roman Empire and the other powers that be, a long-standing problem with the struggle for power in Europe. Who was going to settle these power debates? And if Rome conceded too often to the kings of Europe, then it will lose its own temporal power. So anyway, Henry vied for dispensation to marry his brother's widow, and then his brother's widow couldn't give him a son, and so he had to divorce her. he thought he had to divorce her, and so he applied again for dispensation from Rome to divorce his wife, and Rome said no. It wasn't going to be pushed around by the heads of Europe. And what else could Rome do if it had not said no? It would have been the puppet of the European kings. We knew how that was after Avignon. That was not a good thing. So Rome said no. And so Henry broke from Rome and created his own church, the Anglican Church, in the heat of the Reformation, which was going on the continent. Because the Reformation on the continent was, by that time, in full swing. And Henry had himself, probably ghost written by Thomas More, but Henry had himself, only a few years prior to his divorce, had written a treatise proclaiming the correct obedience to Rome and why it was important to be obedient to Rome. And so here he was now divorcing his wife and splitting from the church and creating his own Anglican church. So, in short, it was a ghastly mess. Henry goes on to get another wife who could not get him a child, had her killed. Got another wife who got him a child who was sickly. And then when Henry, after several other wives later, he dies, and the throne is left vacant, and there's warfare again because his sickly son dies, and his daughter, Elizabeth, fights a protracted war with the other heir to the throne, and who is Bloody Mary. And she wins, and it's in that atmosphere that then Shakespeare begins his writing. Again, warfare across the nation, and plague coming up, and of course the on the edge of starvation all the time because of the climate. And he's writing then during the era where Elizabeth has died and succeeded the throne to James, King James Bible and all. And so here's Shakespeare writing in this context of not just the scholastic debate, but he's writing in the context of all this warfare and starvation and plague and political intrigue that had gone on. And it's really, if one considers, it's the end of the Renaissance. That's the era in which we say he's writing. The Renaissance was a philosophical movement that had started sometime in the mid to late 1400s. And you could say that the end of the Renaissance ended up being kind of dark, kind of bleak. And so Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet is written during that era. And I think it puts a spin on what we're looking at here in the play. Because again, he's not writing during a time of great hope and happiness, really. He's writing during a time, I think, of great cynicism and kind of a bleakness to what's going on there in Europe. So, that being said, we have the scholastic debate, we have those 200 years or so of catastrophe that had gone on before he wrote this play, and I think it all comes into the artwork that we see here in Romeo and Juliet. Now let's look at Act 1, Scene 3, Romeo and Juliet. This is one of my favorite scenes. It's the first scene that we see Juliet and her interaction both with Lady Capulet, her mother, and also with the nurse. And the thing to point out is that in the previous scene, Scene 2, we found that Lord Capulet had probably been married before and lost his wife, and now he sees Juliet as the only remaining child of all of his children that apparently have died. And so he's very worried about her. And he doesn't want her to get married to someone she doesn't like, and he doesn't want her to get married early because young girls can die in childbirth. And so he's very cautious, Lord Capulet is. We see also that Juliet is not even 14 years old yet. She's only 13 years old, so she's right on the cusp of womanhood. She's not an experienced woman at all. And her mother reveals here, we'll find, her mother reveals that she had Juliet when she was 13, when she was Juliet's age, which puts Lady Capulet somewhere in her mid-20s, still a young woman. And that, again, that changes something of what we read here in Act 1, Scene 3. So without further ado, let's go ahead and read along here. If you have your copy of Romeo and Juliet, William Shakespeare, Act 1, Scene 3. Enter Lady Capulet and the nurse. Lady Capulet begins. Nurse, where's my daughter? Call her forth to me. The nurse. Now by my maidenhead at 12-year-old I bade her come. What lamb, what lady bird, God forbid, where's this girl? What Juliet? Enter Juliet. How now? Who calls? Your mother. Madam, I am here. What is your will? This is the matter. Nurse, give leave a while. We must talk in secret. Nurse, come back again. I have remembered me. Thou's hear our counsel. Thou knowest my daughter's of a pretty age. Faith, I can tell her age unto an hour. She's not 14. I'll lay 14 in my teeth. And yet to my teen be it spoken, I have but 4. She's not 14. How long is it now to Lammas tide? A fortnight and odd days. Even or odd of all days in the year, come Lammas Eve at night, shall she be 14. Susan and she, God rest all Christian souls, were of an age. Well, Susan is with God. She was too good for me. But as I said, on Lammas Eve at night shall she be 14. That shall she. Mary, I remember it well. 'Tis since the earthquake now 11 years, and she was weaned. I never shall forget it. Of all the days of the year, upon that day, for I had then laid wormwood to my dug, sitting in the sun under the dove-house wall. My lord and you were then in Mantua. Nay, I do bear a brain. But as I said, when it did taste the wormwood on the nipple of my dug, and felt it bitter pretty fool to see it tetchy, and fall out with the dug. Shake, quoth the dove-house, 'twas no need, I trow, to bid me trudge. And since that time, it is 11 years. For then she could stand high lone, nay, by the rood, she could have run and waddled all about. For even the day before she broke her brow, and then my husband, God be with his soul, it was a merry man, he took up the child. Yea, quoth he, dost thou fall upon thy face? Thou wilt fall backward when thou hast more wit. Wilt thou not, Jewel? And by my holidame, the pretty wretch left crying, and said, I, to see how a jest shall come about, I warrant, and I should live 1,000 years, I never should forget it. Wilt thou not, Jewel? Quoth he, a pretty fool that stitted and said, I. Enough of this. I pray thee, hold thy peace. Yes, madam. Yet I cannot choose but laugh to think it should leave crying and say I. And yet I warrant it had upon it brow a bump as big as a young cockerel's stone, a perilous knock, and it cried bitterly. Yea, quoth my husband, fallest upon thy face, thou wilt fall backward when thou comest to age, wilt thou not, Jewel? And stint and said I. And stand thou too, I pray thee. Nurse, say I. Peace. I have done. God mark thee to his grace. Thou wast the prettiest babe that e'er I nursed, and I might live to see thee married once. I have my wish. Mary. That Mary is the very theme I came to talk of. Tell me, daughter Juliet, how stands your disposition to be married? It is an honor that I dream not of. Sucked wisdom from thy teat. Well, think of marriage now. Younger than you, here in Verona, ladies of esteem are made already mothers. By my count, I was your mother much upon these years that you are now a maid. Thus, then, in brief, the valiant Paris seeks you for his love. A man, young lady! Lady, such a man is all the world! Why, he's a man of wax. Verona's summer hath not such a flower. Nay, he's a flower, in faith, a very flower. What say you? Can you love the gentleman? This night you shall behold him at our feast. This precious book of love, this unbound lover to beautify him, only lacks a cover. The fish lives in the sea, and 'tis much pride for fair without the fair within tide. That book in many's eyes doth share the glory, that in gold clasps locks in the golden story. So shall you share all that he doth possess, by having him, making yourself no less. No less? Nay, bigger women grow by men. Speak briefly. Can you like of Paris's love? I'll look to like, if looking, liking move. But no more deep will I in doubt mine eye, than your consent gives strength to make it fly. Enter a serving man. Madam, the guests are come. Supper served up, you called, my young lady asked for, the nurse cursed in the pantry, and everything in extremity. I must hence to wait. I beseech you, follow straight. We follow thee. Juliet, the county stays. Go, girl! Seek happy nights to happy days. Exeunt. And when you're fleshing out the character of Juliet, one always has to look at the backstory of a character in drama. And what's their motive? What is it that motivates them to do what they do? Juliet is young, and she's obviously beautiful, and she's obviously rich. And I think her relationship to her parents tells us a great deal. Her daddy dotes on her and doesn't want her to skin her knee or do anything that might hurt herself, and he's worried about her. Mama wants her to get married to this guy, Paris. It seems like a decent chap. We saw that in scene 2. But as it says back here, the nurse recounts that when Juliet was weaned from the nurse, Lady Capulet and the Lord were in Mantua, visiting in Mantua. They were away. They were gone. One could say that was a frequent occurrence. The wealthy parents of this young girl were frequently gone on business or otherwise. Juliet was raised by a surrogate mother. A common practice at the time, it's true, especially among the wealthy. But even today, it's a common practice among the wealthy frequently to have their children be raised by someone else. And when it happens, there is sometimes the possibility of damage to the child. The child becomes resentful or angry. And we see very little here that indicates that Juliet may be angry, but it seems as though her affections are far closer attached to the nurse than to her own mother. She says to her mother, I'll do this if you command me. I'll do this because it's my duty, right? But I'm not ready to fall in love necessarily. She says, no more deep will I endart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly. So she seems like a very dutiful daughter. It's true. But there's very little affection between her and her mother, it would seem. On the other hand, her mother, who again is 26, 27 years old, her mother is very eager to get Paris to marry Juliet. And there are some commentators who suggest that maybe Lady Capulet and Paris have a thing for each other. That maybe there's something going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. Certainly, Lady Capulet does go on at length about how beautiful Paris is and what a great man he is. It may not indicate anything, but it may also indicate that Paris is one of her conquests, that Paris is a young man that she dotes on. Paris doesn't seem to be much older than Lady Capulet, if at all, maybe even her same age. And she wants her daughter married to Paris. That might not sit well. And if we're looking for a motive for what happens in the rest of the play, it is possible that the motive could be here, that Juliet doesn't get along with her mother, maybe even wants to find a way to stab back at her mother, to hurt her mother. It's possible. And if read that way, it explains a great deal of why she objects to a marriage which otherwise there doesn't seem to be any objection to. Because Paris is a very decent guy. And why would she object to getting married to this decent guy unless perhaps it was because she disliked her mother and wanted to stab back at her mother? The nurse is a fabulous character and has that wonderful little dirty joke that she passes on about Juliet falling on her backside when she's older, which I don't need to explain to the kids here, but you can figure it out. But it is interesting to note that it's the nurse who has memories of Juliet and not Lady Capulet. It's the nurse who has funny stories about Juliet, not Lady Capulet. The nurse herself has a deep affection for Juliet and sees her as her own daughter. Because her own daughter, as it says early on, Susan, died roughly around the same age that Juliet was born. And so she adopts Juliet as her own daughter, essentially, and has weaned Juliet, has nourished Juliet from her own breast from early on, and not Lady Capulet. Lady Capulet gives birth to Juliet, but doesn't actually nourish her from early on. This is called wet nursing. And it was done frequently when you couldn't afford or didn't have time to raise your own child. But it was also done frequently by wealthier peoples who didn't want to lose their figure in child rearing. And so Lady Capulet, again, for looking for a motive, Lady Capulet farms out Juliet to this nurse because she is still part of this jet-set life. She's still part of this very wealthy lifestyle that she doesn't want to give up. And so the affection is not there between Lady Capulet and Juliet. Again, if we're looking for a motive, that could be a very fine motive to take from the play. When we get together next time, we'll read Scene 4, Act 1, Scene 4. Until then, I'm going to make a hot toddy or something because my throat hurts. I hope you all are well. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and God bless you all.